Welcome to 7 Skills for the Future podcast. My name is Emma Sue Prince, and this podcast is based on the internationally selling book by the same name. This book focuses on 7 important skills. They are adaptability, critical thinking, empathy, integrity, being proactive, being optimistic, and being resilient. And this podcast is all about how you can bring these skills into your everyday life so that you are living a life full of happiness, full of purpose, great relationships, doing work that you love, and just really getting the most out of life. So welcome back to 7 Skills for the Future podcast. My name is Emma Sue Prince, and it's great to have you with us on this episode. So in today's episode, we're going to be continuing the interview with Alex Soojung-Kim Pang. If you didn't catch the first part of this interview, do go back in your feed and find it because it's just fascinating. It's all about how to get more productive and shorten our working week. So in part 2, we're going to be talking about how I myself have switched to a 4-day week and the impact of that. And we are also going to talk about how individuals and freelancers and, regardless of what kind of work you do, how you can bring more balance into your life. He's got lots of tips about that. And what someone can do when they feel really stressed and overwhelmed by work. So Alex has loads of tips and ideas, so I'm sure you're going to really enjoy the interview. So here we go. I have to say, I have actually started, but because I have my own business, I have started to do a 4-day week and have Fridays off. And I do find that it is very productive. And it concentrates your time into those 4 days.
It does. And I think that one of the benefits for companies is that the immediacy of the reward is really valuable, right? It's one thing in companies to do to introduce new technologies or some change management process that has an impact on stock price 6 months from now, right? The disconnect between the big investment you've got to make right now and the pain you have to endure versus the company benefiting kind of often creates a challenge in making those sorts of efforts a success. On the other hand, when you do a bunch of things that let you and your colleagues leave and turn off the lights Thursday afternoon, that's a really different proposition. And it means that because you can see the benefits really immediately, that you can for one thing make adjustments a lot more quickly, but it also creates a great incentive to try new things, to stick with what works, to work with your colleagues, to figure out what new processes, technologies, or practices you can all develop so that you can all leave on Thursday and enjoy a long weekend every weekend.
Imagine it creates quite a lot of collaboration. Everybody's bought into the whole idea,
It does. And, there are a couple people I hear stories of who will leave rather than do this, that having an extra day off isn't worth it to them for whatever reason. But for the people who stay, they talk about how, this is a pretty unique experience, right? It's often pretty intense. It requires rethinking everything that you do. And, very often these are people who have been, who are industry veterans, right? They've been doing this for 10 or 15 years. So they really know how business normally works. They're often experienced enough also to know what's really kind of stupid about the way we work. And, you've got a kind of list of things that you would love to change if you had the chance. Well, now you have the chance. And the experience of doing that together with other people is really, can be a really terrific bonding experience. The other thing that these companies do is it's not just about, having like focused downtime where you're kind of antisocial. It's about creating better boundaries between work time and social time. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that happens to kind of counterbalance those periods of focus is people are more social during things like lunch hours. So, rather than grabbing a sandwich and eating at your desk and checking Facebook, people will like gather together. And that's when, you hang out and you talk.
Yeah.
And it turns out, you often have better, not surprisingly, better social relationships with people when you have time when you actually focus on those people, focus on those relationships. And so and so social life actually becomes better. And then even in a couple places, they start cooking. You have a sort of rota where people take turns with this. And even that turns out to make places more successful, more collaborative places to work. There's a wonderful, wonderful study of firehouses. And in the United States, sort of fire companies, fire engines, the people who work there will have these long shifts and they cook together. And fire companies that cook together actually perform better on the job than fire companies that don't. So, and all of this stuff in companies that are doing 4-day weeks kind of happens organically. It's not that companies set out to do it this way, but people kind of naturally gravitate to having these more social times to counterbalance the more focused periods. But they turn out to be times that benefit everyone in multiple ways.
Do you have some favorite success stories from the companies you've worked with?
Yeah, I think one of my favorites is a company called Pursuit Marketing, which is in Glasgow, and they're really interesting because they do telemarketing, and so. This is a bit, and they measure absolutely everything, right? How many seconds people are on calls, how much money you make this day. There are all sorts of metrics that they have to know how people are doing. This is also an industry where job hopping is really, really common. You're always moving to the next place to try and get the next bonus. And Glasgow is sort of the call center, one of the call centers of Europe. So lots of places lots of businesses are always starting there or locating there. And a few years ago, Pursuit realized that that the competition was getting more intense, and that they were having challenges with recruiting people, with retention, and so they implemented a 4-day week. And what they found was that not only did recruitment go through the roof and retention, and annual turnover fell to something like 2% a year, but productivity went up more than 30% and has stayed higher. People, of course, are happier. And my favorite story from there is that the first few weeks that it was that the 4-day week started, there were a few people who were coming into the office on Friday, staying there for about an hour and then disappearing. And the managing director was trying to figure out what was going on. And finally, one of them fessed up that they hadn't told their wives that they now had Fridays off. So they were going in, sort of staying a little while, and then, going to the pub for the rest of the day.
That doesn't sound so healthy, though.
No, maybe there might be better ways to to use your extra day than sort of starting the weekend binge earlier. But in their defense, there were also other groups that were going mountain climbing and things. But it's a lovely illustration of both, how moving to a 4-day week creates these opportunities for sort of for sociability, both outside the office, but also inside, and how that's something that turns out to benefit people and people and companies alike.
Now, it makes me think, because we've talked about individuals and companies, what about the education system and schools?
That's a great question. And at least in the States, there are a number of public school systems, state-funded schools, that have implemented 4-day weeks. And they've done this mainly for financial reasons, right? Either budget cuts, or they are rural school systems where kids have to travel a long way to get to school. What they're finding, and after several years of these experiments, is that test scores do not drop. Of course, in America, test scores are the way by which we measure academic success. In rural systems where it's difficult to attract and retain teachers, those measures go up. And in some school systems, they also have more time for arts, for extracurriculars, for the things that usually get cut in either a rush to balance budgets or a desire to make education more relevant for the 21st century. So the evidence is that even in elementary and secondary schooling, that there can be benefits to moving to a shorter school day. And of course we all know that kids who have more time for unstructured play are psychologically more mature, they're better developed, they are in all kinds of ways better and nicer people than kids who don't have that time. So it's not just about maintaining levels of academic achievement. It also makes for healthier children.
Yeah, and if companies do it and then schools do it, and then we have an impact on the family,
right?
And all of that.
Yeah, and certainly places, companies do make choices about whether to go to a 4-day week or a 6-hour day, partly depending on things like the school system and the demands of kid pickup. And so one of the things that companies often will struggle with is the question of, okay, well, if we go to 4-day weeks, then, how do you deal with child stuff? How do you deal with these various other things in the bigger system? And I think it would be really interesting to see the same region, or town moving schools and encouraging businesses to adopt 4-day weeks and see how much easier it is.
Yeah, something to write about maybe for the next book.
I mean, there are a couple places in Korea and Spain that have local governments that are developing plans to kind of promote themselves as kind of 4-day week regions. And I don't know how far these have gotten. I mean, I think they haven't gotten very far, but it will be interesting to see whether it's possible to become a magnet for this kind of work, and to see, whether how much of a difference doing things like moving government services or moving schools or other things to similar schedules, it makes it easier for companies to do it, and makes it a more attractive destinations for companies that want to locate.
Fascinating. Just thinking about all the impacts of that. Yeah. So I want to come back to the individual, because we do a lot of work with doctors and lawyers who work in organisations where there's little movement to change, and I can imagine a lot of resistance to the idea of a 4-day week. What sort of recommendations would you give to those people to how they can bring more balance into their lives?
Well, I think that there actually are a couple law firms that have moved to 4-day weeks. The thing that you've got to do is give up hourly billing. You move from that to project-based billing.
Yes.
Once you do that, you're able to retake control over your time and reconceptualize time not as something that you pay for, but as something that you spend. And so, the less of it that you spend, the better off you are. Now, If you're not in a position to do that, then I think that if you look at the lives of physicians and lawyers who are both successful and who don't burn out at 45 or whose career is otherwise greater, I think the couple things that I see are, number one, that they are better at finding ways of protecting their own free time. They're a little, they are, even if you have to check email in the evenings, you don't do it after 8 o'clock, let's say, unless there is a genuine emergency. But in most, or in an awful lot of law, in client service, there's a big difference between what someone feels is urgent and what is really important.
Yes.
And being able to disentangle those two things and having the confidence to know that, this thing is actually something that we can leave until tomorrow, is, that's a valuable thing that you can develop with, sort of with some experience. So, I think that first off, doctors and doctors, lawyers, other people in high intensity fields and service professions have more sustainable careers, lower rates of burnout, if they're better at detaching on evenings and weekends, if they're better at taking vacations. The second thing is having a really serious hobby. Mm-hmm. And this seems a little counterintuitive, but people who are really into mountain climbing or train for triathlons or this, other apparently expensive in terms of time and emotional investment, are actually often happier at work. And partly it's because if you're really good at a job and it is demanding and demands a lot of your attention and time, it can really be difficult to disconnect from that. And having something that is equally engaging often is just about the only thing that will get someone, a person like that out of the office. The other thing is that that hobbies can offer some of the same kinds of pleasures or rewards as work, but in a very, very different kind of context. So, for example, there are lots of scientists who are serious mountain climbers or rock climbers, and they talk about rock climbing as being like science, right? You've got, it's a different kind of engagement with nature, but it's still, but you're still doing stuff in the natural world. You've got this big task that you break down into 1,000 little parts, and then you execute them. It requires a lot of focus, a lot of dedication. So in that way, it's like science. On the other hand, it's also very different in the sense that after, in an afternoon, you either reach the top or you don't, right? The rewards are very clear and they come very quickly, in contrast to research, where you can spend a year conducting an experiment and analyzing the data, and the result is kind of, maybe. And so I think likewise, executives talk about mountain climbing as great because it's like running a company, right? You've got teamwork, you have, again, big tasks, you've got to do all this planning. So for them, they identify a different set of things in the same sport that, again, are like what they like best about their work, without the frustrations and in a compressed time frame. And so while it might seem, if you're an ambitious person, if you're someone who likes your work and is challenged, and is challenged by the fact that it's really easy to stay late, having that kind of serious hobby can actually be really valuable as a way of getting you out of the office, of reminding you when things are tough about what you like best about your work and best about your life, and giving you an incentive to do the kinds of things that we know we ought to do, like get out and exercise and, get out into nature, that provide really serious long-term benefits.
Yeah. That's kind of like Darwin.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And just one last question. There's just so many questions I can think of. But what about the individual who genuinely feels overwhelmed? They are distracted all the time, because the compulsion to check email out of hours or on holiday is very strong. And they're feeling stressed. Where do they start? How can they start?
You describe a lot of people, I think.
I know.
This is a situation I confronted myself. And working as a consultant in Silicon Valley, you're always like, you've always got too many projects, and you're like half a project behind on something all the time. What I would recommend is sort of for people who are in that state is, first off, everybody I've talked about, everybody who learns to practice deliberate rest, who learns to redesign their days, who redesigns their companies in order to allow people to do 5 days work in 4. Every one of those people learns the importance of this the hard way. Everybody has a story about how in some previous job they burned out, or they had a health crisis, or they had something else that made them realize that they had to make a change. So I think that even Nobel Prize winners are stupid about this stuff before they get smart. The good news, therefore, is that it's never too late, right? If you're in this situation, you're kind of right on schedule. So what do you do? And I think that for one thing, there are technologies, like apps and things that can help with disconnecting you from your smartphone or from email at particular times. There's a growing body of these, both for Macintosh and for Windows and Android and iOS. So I won't make any specific recommendations, but but these things aren't difficult to find. But I think that I think that learning to reclaim your attention, learning to back away from the sort of kind of bright stimulus of always wanting to check your email, of always responding to that latest ping. That is something that takes a little time, but it is something that you can learn to do. One of the things that I see, first things that I see people doing with their phones is turning off all the notifications except for people who are really, really important to them. One of the people I interviewed calls this the zombie apocalypse test, right? In the zombie apocalypse, who do you need to actually be able to reach? And those people can get through to you no matter what. Everybody else, you want to be able to make a choice about whether or not they interrupt you, whether they command your attention. And actually what I do is, for immediate family, I have one ringtone, which is the opening bars of Derek and the Dominoes' Layla, which no matter where I am, I'm going to notice. Yeah. And that also signals, oh, that's my wife or my kids. The whole rest of the world gets a Yo-Yo Ma cello concerto, which is much easier for me to ignore if I'm really focused, and easier for me to make a choice about when I do have time. And I think that those, things like that turn out to be, they sound small, but they can reinforce good habits, and they can be valuable in helping us recover our time, recover our attention. And then I think the other good thing about our smartphones is, we live with them. Many of us check our email or interact with our phones something like 150 times a day. And so it's both a big source of distraction, but it's also a great place in which to begin experimenting with how you recover your attention. Mm-hmm. And I think once you start doing that, once you start asking questions about, why are these settings this way, right? Or how can I change these so that I'm distracted less by these notifications and this app? Once you begin to do that, that's good practice for the rest of your life. Because the same kinds of strategies for capturing our attention, the same stimuli, these are things that are present out in the rest of the world. And so if we can practice conquering them on our phones, we can practice conquering them in the world.
Those are really great tips.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so
thank
much.
you.
Alex, thank you. This has been a great interview, and I know you've given our listeners lots of food for thought. So how can they find out more about you and get a hold of this new book, Shorter?
Right. Well, Shorter is out in bookstores March 5th. So, wherever fine books are sold, or, other kinds of books, I suppose. And then if you want to or follow the recent work that I'm doing, I'm continuing to find new companies that are experimenting with 4-day weeks, that are doing trials. And so I'm continuing to write about those and other parts of this global movement that is really only now just becoming aware of itself on my company website, which is strategy.rest. Happily, REST is now a top-level domain, just like .com and and .org. And then on Twitter and everything else, I'm Ask Pang, AskPang.
Great, thank you. And we'll make sure all those are in the show notes. And thank you so much for being on the show. It's been great to have you.
Thanks, Emma. So it's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the 7 Skills for the Future podcast. You can find all of our episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere where podcasts can be found. If you want to make sure that every new episode ends up on your phone, all you need to do is hit the subscribe button. And while you're there, why not give us a 5-star review so more people can find out about the show? If you'd like to stay in touch or send in one of your questions for Emma Sue, then go to Unimenta on Twitter, 7 Skills for the Future on Instagram, or at unimenta.com. We'd love to hear from you. And of course, there's the book, 7 Skills for the Future, available at booksellers everywhere.